bill. It cost the state $77 million for the biennium, which is a big sum of money. I mean, it did more than just inflationary adjustments for the school, but what else did it do, and can you address that bill?
Sure. A part of that money is actually the inflation piece, but a part of it goes into what they call the guaranteed base. So the money for the schools has to come from somewhere. It comes from the state or it comes from the county. Now, if you don't pay for it at the state level, you pay for it at the county level. If you're going to pay for it at the county level, guess where it comes from?
Property taxes.
From us.
Property taxes, that's right. So yep, you can vote against school funding, and you can vote against inflationary increases, and you can vote against putting in the guaranteed base. But do not fool yourself into thinking that you're saving any money, because you're not. It's going to be paid for from the county, and county property taxes will go up. So, you know, people, and it's not just the schools, it's all kinds of things. I cannot tell you how many bills I saw that came across, and I started keeping track of them about the last month and a half, because these bills would come through, and they'd say, you know, we're going to put this great idea in place. And they say, okay, there's another public defender. You know, so who pays for the public defenders? You know, the state is over budget on public defenders every single session by a lot of money. And you have to pay it. You have no choice. So these bills come through, and everybody's feeling good because the fiscal note says 0. But up at the top, there's a little box check that says significant local impact, you know, which means your county's going to pay for it. So all I would ask legislators is that if you're going to vote against something like school funding, understand who's paying for it. Because you didn't save a penny. You just took it out of one pocket and put it in the other. So, yeah. So that's...
Oh, I have a question here.
I'm not going to ask your question already.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
No, this is,
That's all right.
help you.
So I'm kind of new to these kinds of conversations, but how do you decide how much of our taxes go towards the universities and how much go to K-12? The difference is because this gentleman talked about how much money this person makes. And we all kind of like to get settled and get annoyed by these big dollars. But it does appear at times that K-12 tends to focus and rely on its local community a lot more because they come back with, I need a bond, I need a levy, I need. So how do you make those decisions? How do you decide how much of our taxes going to university situations that not all people participate in, and the school level where we do all participate in?
Well, you know, I'm trying to think of the easiest way to explain this. Let me just talk to you about how the budget building process works. I'll try to keep it short here. When we see the budget requests that come in, we get a request from the Commissioner of Higher Education that covers the university system, and we get something out of the Office of Public Instruction. Actually, it comes from both of these come from the governor, but you the people that actually put the requests together, and they'll request money to. You know, the first thing is they have a base budget that's already in existence. We, generally speaking, accept that as their current level of spending, and then you have kind of formulaic increases due to inflation and that sort of thing. And you can futz with that because a lot of this is personnel costs, and as Nancy said earlier, you can decide, well, that's all well and good, but you don't need this many full-time equivalents, and you can.
And isn't that, don't you base a lot of that off of students,
Oh yeah,
K-12 students?
Sure, and that gets to just the other aspect of state law in there as well, and just getting back to the budget building process. And so you examine this, you know, the basic what it takes to keep present law in place. That includes inflation. In other words, you build it, you know, the agencies come forward, they're told to do something by law. Here's what it costs to do it by law. And so they present us that, and we take a look at some of that on the margins. They also provide us new ideas that the governor has, and those are new proposals, and those get a lot more scrutiny. What Senator Thomas alluded to is how does funding work in K-12 education? From your days on the school board, you probably are familiar with this. There are very specific state laws that dictate the level of funding that go to the K-12 system. And those state laws also dictate what portion the state pays and what portion the localities pay. And so if we want to change that, it's a matter of changing the state laws that govern that. Within the budget building process itself, we deal with the laws as they exist. We're setting on appropriate. With respect to the university system, our decisions there are fundamentally not exactly true. This is not exactly true. But as I said earlier, that we have that murky line that we are not allowed, or veil that we can't look through, or look through it opaquely. And so it's harder to see what's going on over there. For instance, when it comes to cutting staff, we have zero say on cutting of staff for within the university itself. Now, we can cut the commissioner of higher education staff. Newsflash: he doesn't have very many people working directly for him. So there's a real problem of control. So and it prevents us from doing that sort of thing. Now, as I said earlier, though, when I talked about the rice bowls, university system and the K-12 system are in the same rice bowl. So if we decide we think some of the new proposals that are being put forward by the governor are good, or by the superintendent of public instruction, Elsie Arnston, or Republican, then we can certainly support those, and we can look to some of the funding lines in the university system and see whether we want to reduce those. For instance, one that came up to that we looked at carefully was there was a request for I forget the number right now. I want to say about $10 million in needs-based tuition or assistance. We cut that in half. We said no, can't have that. Now you can have a tuition freeze, but you can't have both. By doing that, we also freed up some money that could be allocated in the K-12 arena in things like safety and stuff like that. But that's how we work through that. That's how we work through that.
Okay, and we have a budget question.
Budget
for
question.
Nancy.
Okay.
So typically, I don't know if the state always has debt, but it seems like this time they decided that it was important to sell bonds and create debt. And do you know what projects, was it the infrastructure or other projects?
Yeah, couple pieces said, and the question was about state debt. Currently, we're at one of the lowest levels we've been in a long time. Our bond payments are $7.5 million a year, which is extremely low. So every session, the bonding question was coming up. How much debt is the right amount of debt? Well, it had never been looked at that way. So there's a fiscal leaders conference that a national group holds every year. I went to that last summer, and it was one of the main questions that we started talking to people about. So how much debt are you carrying in your state? And how do you determine how much debt is the right amount of debt? And one of the states we looked at was Utah, because people were saying, well, that's not a conservative thing to do to carry debt. And yet we look at Utah, that's one of the most conservative states in the nation, and they carry a whole lot more debt than we do on any measure you want to look at. So we started thinking it through and looked at it actually all through the summer and up to the session and said, how do we get past this debt question? Because it's not really a question of whether or not you should pay for something using bonds versus cash. It's a question of how much debt is the right amount of debt for the state to carry. So when I talked earlier about putting the infrastructure framework in place, we said, okay, what should it be based on? Well, Utah bases theirs on the amount of taxable property in the state. Well, that's interesting, and it's a good number to know. But maybe another number to put with that is how much debt payment should you carry? So how much debt service should you carry at any point in time? So we said, well, add that to the equation as well. And then we said, no, wait a minute, what about other things that are, that's fine for talking about general obligation bonds, but what about other things like pension debt? How does that enter into the equation? So we said, okay, when we talk about state debt from now on, until somebody changes it, we are going to talk about the accumulation. Our outstanding debt has to be general obligation bonds that are already committed, pension debt, and then any new projects you want to talk about. So you have to talk about all three of those things or nothing, because we're not talking about new projects anymore by themselves, because it just doesn't make sense. So then we started doing a lot of research and looking at what is the right amount of debt, meaning all those three things, for the state of Montana. And we ended up with 0.6% of taxable value. And there was we went through so many scenarios I can't even tell you, but that was the number we decided to start with. 0.6% of taxable value, meaning all the property in the entire state. And then for debt service, we said never more than 1.5% of the previous year's revenue. So never more bond payments than 1.5% of the previous year's revenue. And again, we went through tons of scenarios to get through to that point. But we said, okay, that'll be our starting point. And then that becomes your outstanding debt. And out of that, you have to pay pension payments. So your pension debt is first. So you look at any time the pension debt goes above that borrowing line that you've set for yourself, you can't borrow anything. No general obligation bonds can be put out for new projects if your pension debt is so high that all of a sudden you're not able to fund it within the boundaries we've set. So that's really the key point, is we finally decided and talked about what's meant by the right amount of debt in the state of Montana, what is included in that, which is all three of those things, and then you can borrow short term. We said, okay, we're only borrowing 10-year, we're not going 20-year bonds, and yeah, it costs us a little bit more, but we're not doing 20-year bonds. Well, because typically you try to bond for the life of whatever it is you're bonding for. Buildings and things have a long life, other things have a shorter life, so we said, well, let's keep it shorter, keep it a 10-year bond. And then it was staying within those parameters we set for ourselves. And then additionally what we did is we said, if it's a poor economic situation at the time, the money that's accumulated in this fund that you have set up with the bonding that you did and with the cash you put in, we call that a working rainy day fund. So in addition to our rainy day fund, now we have a working rainy day fund that says, in the good times, you can put that to work. And you can pay for building maintenance, and a certain portion of it has to be for building maintenance. And then if you still have some money left, you can put it for new projects. If the economy is bad, then you cannot use that money, because the assumption is that money might be needed for some economic situation that you had not planned for because the economy is bad. So if you go into a recession, for example, the last thing you want to be doing is going into more debt and using that money to pay for buildings. What you want to be doing is using it to cover obligations of the state. So let me make sure that, did that answer it, Jane?
Yeah.
Well,
I think Ray had a follow-on to that. Did you?
Yeah, I was just curious what your pension debt is right now. It should be pretty good, shouldn't it?
It's pretty good. There's some, there are a couple that are not amortizing within the 30-year period that we set.
Right.
And we're still using probably an interest rate that's too high. But instead of, I think we had outstanding obligations of like $12 million. There were some that wanted to just use cash and pay that off. Yeah. And we said no, because the last finance committee session that we had during the interim, we decided to do a risk analysis, to do a real heavy look, have an outside group do a risk analysis on our pension systems, and then decide what kind of changes we want to make. Because there are some states that are doing some really interesting things with pensions, where they'll have, instead of talking, we always never got past the discussion of defined benefit versus defined contribution. Now what they're starting to do is some of the guaranteed annual increases are flexible, so that in good economic times you pay more of the guaranteed annual, and in bad times you pay less. So and some states have been really effective with it, but it takes a long time, and it takes a long time to get legislators used to the idea of what you're going to do. So
So you're still 12
we've got two
million down
studies.
now.
We were 12 million unamortized over, I think it's 12.2 unamortized over all of the pension systems. How many pension systems we have? 10 or so.
Yeah.
Teachers and state and firefighters and police and all that.
Okay.
So, which is not too bad compared to where we were, but we're creeping up. So we've got two studies going on during the interim, one with the state admin committee, one in the finance committee, to look heavily at that, and then we'll bring our groups together and talk about what we might want to introduce or start looking at for next session.
So, in other words, you're not able to issue any general obligation bonds for anything right now because of the 12 million.
Oh, no, we can't. We absolutely can. Because the 12 million, if you graph it, the 12 million is a small blip on, we had like $80 million available, so the 12 was not much of a blip there. But the key point was that had to be included. So if it had gone way up, spiked way up like it did in 2011, 29,
Right.
then you would not have been able to issue any general obligation bonds during that period. But the 12 million is just a small, we throw the millions around like that. But it was a small blip in the whole scheme.
It's a lot of money at the county level.
It's, yeah. But small in the grand scheme.
Yeah.
So we were able to put $80 million into infrastructure this time around.
That's good.